So I will take you very quickly through what may seem like an intense presentation. The idea here, of course, is to get a broad sweep of the kind of trends that we have seen over the last 5 to 10 years in the urban space. It is really broad. I would encourage us not to get into substantial questions just now. We'll have an open discussion later. But the idea is to get the sweep of where we're coming from. And I think what we try to do here is to try and build the linkage from the micro to the macro. So I'm going to use two screens and walk across because we're going to use intertemporal analysis. So you'll have to bear with me. It's going to be both interesting and intense, but let's go. Okay, so this is sort of the long-term trend from 61 to 2011 of the growth of cities, larger urban centers. Again, one of the there's a tension in the sense of the discourse. There's one part of the political imagination that still thinks that India lives in its villages. That's true, but that's increasingly not true. And you can see that in the nature of Indian politics and how it's actually changing. There's also another part of the discourse which is also, I would say somewhat extreme, which says that there's a huge urban explosion happening in India. That's actually not true, especially if you run the international comparisons. We're much less urbanized than we should be at the current levels of GDP. But if you look at the trend, you can see obviously there's significant growth taking place in different parts of the country. The size of the bubble corresponds to the population size of the location, and you can see there's concentration happening in particular geographies. That's just the quick time sweep of how this process is working itself out. Next slide. But the thing that we often forget, and this is very important in India's context, on this side we have urban, but the ground is very important both process-wise in terms of people and otherwise. So this is the first time in some senses that in this country, as far as I know, we're able to visualize both urban and rural together. My colleagues have done a tremendous piece of work over the last almost 9 months or so of actually locating every single place in this country. It was a huge exercise, as you imagine. The census and Survey of India should have done this a long time back. But what we've done is, what you see on these two slides here is a map, and of course it's at relatively low resolution, we can zoom it out, is a map of about 6.5 lakh settlements. And I think when you look at the continuum, you can see two things. One is the massive concentration at the high end of urban population in million-plus cities. That's where a lot of India's value addition and a lot of its incremental sort of employment is taking place. And then on the other hand, the growth of medium-sized villages and small villages across the country. So this is the real challenge, I think, for us, and also a great opportunity, because unlike China and unlike Latin America, as it urbanized in the 1950s all the way till, I would say, 70s or early 80s, we have a tremendous opportunity in this country. We have 640,000 villages, fine, 6,40,000 villages, and we have about, let's say, 8,000 urban centers. And so for us, the opportunity of keeping that balance is really real. And what we've seen, especially if you look at migration over the last 20 or 30 years, is the transitions are not happening as quickly as possible. Unfortunately, now with the agrarian collapse and the pressures of climate change, we may see more acceleration of that. But the fundamental story for India is that we are a decentralized system of production, consumption, and politics. And I think that balance, and you'll see how it is very different in different parts of the country. You can see the densities of Kerala and let's say North Bihar in many other locations. This is something that we really need to be able to understand, because both in the policy and the political integration, we can't say only urban or rural. It really is the balance. When we were working in Andhra Pradesh, and Free and his team was working on on the state of the same thing. The balance is the critical question. How does one keep the regional balance? How does one enable sort of employment growth within smaller towns and of course large villages, which are almost urban-like, is a really critical question. Next slide. So this is a sort of a structural description of this. This looks at the structure of human settlements. That means all places in this country from 1951, and it's projected out, and you can see the projections for the next 4 years. It's a 100-year trend, fine, of how we see the urban and the rural. So all the reds, in a sense, above this line that you see here are what notionally we could call urban, and everything below that is rural. So this, for example, here, 44%, what this tells you here, 44%. So in 1951, around the time of the first general election or the first census here, 44% of people in India lived in hamlets with a population less than 1,000 people. Fine, that's what that means here. And the, that bar at the top there, 3% is the number of people who lived in million cities. That's the continuum. So this is really important for us to understand because of two things. The first thing is India's political imagination just now, and many of us have been involved in these debates, is still that India lives in its villages. That's true. But if you look at this, the hamlets that we're talking about here, it's going to go down almost into single digits. These are projections as far as we're concerned. So there's a deep structural change taking place, obviously demographically. As populations grow, you will find larger, this segment here of medium-sized and large-sized villages growing, fine. Plus, as connectivity grows, and this is what we've seen especially over the last, 15 or 20 years, certainly over the last 10 years, as GQ and all the other connectivity at macro and micro level and PMGSY have actually progressed, you see that transition happening. Simultaneously, you find other class 1 cities, population of more than 1 lakh actually growing quite significantly. So the big question for us here, of course, is when will India be half rural, half urban in demographic terms? And this is a long debate. Amitabh is not here. We've had this debate before about whether it will happen in the 2040s or 2050s. But this is something which is important to understand because the global discourse, and China of course is racing in the other direction, is towards hyper-urbanization. But in fact, as far as we're concerned, somewhere between 2040 and 2050, we'll become half urban and half rural. But remember, that's with a population of 1.5, maybe 1.55, 1.6 billion people. That means 800 million people in rural areas and 800 million people in urban areas. So the connection between the two is absolutely central, whether it's in terms of jobs, employment, access to services, etc. So this is a question that I think we're asking again and again, not only at the level of the country, but at the level of each state and at the level of each district. And thankfully, even though the census has taken so long to release the data, we can actually drill down and pretty much now, since we have the full database of the country of every place, you can do this at block level and even lower clusters. So just in terms of people who are in the research and in policy engagement team, the process of building this up from bottom up or top down, making the connections is really important. It enables us to concretize our planning processes, to look at clusters, and you'll see that in a few slides that I'll show you just now. The patterns actually throw themselves up very clearly once you look at all places. If you don't only focus on the rural or the urban, which in some senses are artificial divisions. If you change the definitions, and this is by flexing the 3 census parameters, you actually find that India is much more urban than we thought. This is like China. China has suddenly become much more urban because they changed the definitions. So if you flex the definitions, especially about the proportion of male workers in non-agricultural occupations, you find that the definition would actually change. And we can do that because we have the full data set. So this is something else. Like I showed it to you earlier, sort of in spatial terms, but this is in structural terms. So another way of looking at this, all the settlements in the country in 2011, of course you can't see, it gets so dense here that you can't see anything, it becomes a blur, but in actual fact if you zoom this database, and we have it here and you require pretty smart machines to do it, you can go down and you can see the clustering taking place. This is the pattern that you see right across, the same chart that I saw you earlier. This is the urban, so you can see union territories, of course, Chandigarh, Delhi, etc. Much larger urban population. Chandigarh up there, of course, is largely urban, very little rural. So this is the same pattern for across all states of the country. And what I'm saying is that as we go forward, taking this analysis down and dealing with it at the state and regional level, as many people have done in this room, would actually be quite useful. Next slide. But what's driving this process? Two things, and this again is once you start visualizing it at settlement level, you get very interesting trends at here. This is the sex ratio. So sex ratio is something that we've been very concerned about because our sex ratio is low and it's declining in some senses. The somewhat good news is that the national average has increased from 933 to 943 in 2011. Now the interesting thing that you will see here, this is a little bit of a sort of heterodox representation, is the representation is the reds are negative changes with respect to the national average, and the greens are positive changes. So when you look at this thing, what do you see? The first thing that you see is sex ratios in some of the metropolitan regions, or let's say if you look at Western India, have actually dropped over that period of time. And you also see sex ratios increasing in some senses, quite surprisingly, in some parts of Eastern UP and Bihar. Now there are different reasons for that. This one, of course, is driven by outmigration in some senses. Men are moving out. We have a number of demographers in this place. But the interesting thing is, like I said, when you are able to go in and look at stuff at settlement level, you get a sense of what's happening. What's happening around the East Coast, for example, is quite dramatic. We've known about the Kerala story for a long time. So This is one of the underlying demographic trends that are there. You can see the notional problems that we've had with sex determination, etc., in Punjab and Haryana, and that part of the country where it's leading to a whole range of really odd things, including a lot of trafficking. So the data actually throws this up when you're able to look at it in an aggregate sense. Similarly, I think the big story of the last 15 years has been the dramatic increase since 1995 when we started to push for the SSA of increase in literacy. So dramatic increases in literacy. You can see that by these bars here. You can see the mean growth has been quite high. The national average has grown from 65 to 73%. Of course, more in the most important trend, of course, is for women. And here you can see where that change is taking place. I think for those of us who've worked in rural India, the most interesting thing is to see this massive shift that's taking place in the Gangetic Plain there, in many parts of UP and Bihar, and of course, the obvious other locations that are there. So you see a significant shift taking place as far as that's concerned. Obviously, cities have greater literacy rates than the national average, and particular states have a strong, spatial pattern as far as that's concerned. So these two things underlying this process, improving sex ratios in some senses, but also migration. One would imagine that in a country of India's scale and diversity and challenges as far as population and poverty are concerned, that we'd see a lot more migration. But these are obviously deeply challenged areas. But also on the human development side, considerable improvement that we're seeing. I think this is something that, the country's done a lot of things that are not very good, but this is one thing in which we've achieved a lot, in spite of the fact that the situation in schools in many parts of the country is actually pretty poor. Those of us who've traveled and worked know that things are not doing as well as they could do. Next slide. So when you look at this in the classic, age-sex pyramid, you get a very interesting sort of pattern. That is 99-2000. This is from the NSS, and that is 2011-12. So what do we see here? This is rural, and that is urban above that. These are actually to the same scale. So the first thing that you see, of course, is obviously, 1/3 of the population is in urban areas, about that much, and 68-67% is in rural areas. The reds are people who've never been to school. Fine. The oranges are people who've gone to primary school. The blues are people who've gone to middle and higher secondary school. And we are just a small little blot at the end of this process here. People who actually went to some form of higher education. So if you look at this, at this process, there are 2 or 3 things that are pretty obvious. The first thing is classic, for those of us, plain demography, classic Christmas tree kind of structure that's there. Transitions start happening already in 2000. This is the 2001 census in urban areas. You can see, the lowest cohort having a smaller population base. But if you go to 2011-12, you see the same process starting to happen in rural India. And of course, this is a demographic transition that's starting in south and the west, running a little bit more slowly in north and eastern India. So the Christmas tree actually starting to play out in different locations. That's the first thing that you see. The second thing, of course, is the dramatic momentum of illiteracy in India. So look at the reds. Yeah. So even though there's been a huge improvement in terms of school enrollment, which you can see here in rural areas, primary school enrollment here. These, of course, are this is 0 to 9, which means a lot of children go to school when they're only 4 or 5 or 6 years old. There's a massive increase in school enrollment that's there. However, the demographic momentum of people who've never been educated is still very strong. So, we've in some senses decapitated our adult literacy programs. If you look at the demographics, we have a serious problem there, because we have a large number of people who are trapped in some senses in rural areas without adequate sort of education. The other thing that's pretty obvious to anybody who looks at it carefully is the gender differential. So look at the difference between women and men in terms of education, both in urban and rural areas, and interesting trends that you see in urban areas in terms of higher education that's there. So you see increasing parity. Yeah. So this is men and this is women in terms of access to higher education, and it's going all the way up as you go through the age groups. So in some senses, these are people who were born in the 80s and 70s, 60s, and most of us are somewhere up there. That's where our sort of cohort actually lies. Next slide. So when you try and visualize this, in sort of spatial terms, you start to see very interesting trends. The first thing, of course, is dramatic increase in female literacy. This is the really big development story in India across pretty much all states. Male literacy is growing, and it's at a higher base, but you can see here the increments are much less than female literacy. And like I mentioned earlier, massive growth as far as we're concerned. And we've seen that. I mean, those of us who work in northern India, Bihar, eastern UP, Orissa, Jharkhand, women and young girls going to school is something that you're seeing much more strongly there. So the data is actually speaking to that experience. Of course, female literacy tends to be higher in some parts, and there are some locations where we still have considerable problems. So in some parts of Rajasthan, the tri-junction here between Gujarat, Madhya Pradesh, and of course all along sort of northern UP, the more backward areas of UP adjoining Nepal, etc., and Telangana, some parts of Chhattisgarh. We know these things, and there isn't much movement in those processes. Next slide, please. Yeah. Okay. So how does this process actually translate into employment? Because that's the core thing that influences development processes. Same age experiments, rural, urban, male, female. This is 2000, that is 2011. And what you see here is quite interesting. The reds here, of course, are the people in the workforce, that is people who are actually working. The oranges are non-workers, and the blues are people who are looking for work, so notionally unemployed. India's got sort of dodgy statistics in this space, but the first thing that's most obvious here is the male-female differential. We know this, but the interesting thing, of course, is when we even look at urban India even now, the fascinating challenge is, in spite of high levels of education, and this is what my colleagues have written about, we're finding women actually stepping out of the workforce. So female workforce participation is actually declining in some locations. Now this is a very interesting conundrum in some senses. We know why it might be happening, or at least we have some hypothesis as social scientists, but we do know that most of the NICs, including China, Korea, etc., the key driver to the end of poverty and economic development there is women actually entering the workforce and changing not only their circumstances but the circumstances of the country. This is not happening as far as we're concerned. And then you see other interesting things. For example, there's the largest cohort in urban areas is in the 30 to 39 age group of workers. And of course, there's a strong male bias as far as that's concerned. So what I'm saying is that this kind of analysis at the state and eventually at the district level will give us a much better handle. We're shouting and screaming a lot about skills, links to employment, etc. We do have the information with us. It's just a question of being able to work with it and deal with it quite effectively. Fine. So the interesting thing, in macro terms is, over the last decade, the number of people added to the workforce was more or less the same in both urban and rural areas. So about 40 million people were added to the workforce in urban areas, which is 1/3 of the population, and 40 million people were added in rural areas. So this is, I guess, the deep demographic and economic challenge we have, the structural challenge that we have. We're just, first of all, not creating enough jobs. And second thing is, we're absolutely not creating enough jobs in the places where most people are. You saw the maps of where people are. People are still a lot in rural areas. We're just not able to add jobs in that space. And even in urban areas, as I'll show you very quickly just now, it's only in particular sectors that we're actually adding the jobs. And this is a real challenge. This is, I guess, going to be one of our most significant developmental and, in some senses, a social and economic challenge in time. Next slide. So, same pattern here, what I was talking to. Again, this is a thing of great concern. This is female workforce participation rates. So the reds mean there's been actually a decline in female WPRs. Punjab, for example, Haryana, Gujarat, there's actually a decline in female WPR. Okay, this is a maladaptive behavior in some senses. And all the reds that you see here are areas that are below the national average of 26%. So 26% as a WPR as far as women is concerned means that we have a big challenge as far as we're concerned compared to male. So male WPR is 53%, and you see some declines in some places, but the most significant decline is in female WPR. There's a decline, and you can see there's a strong spatial correlation. You can see that with Kerala, you can see that across the northern belt. This is something that we need to get a much better handle on. The linkage with both employment and economic development is very crucial, and cities have a lot to do with that. So this is an area that I think we need to actually spend a fair amount of time working on. Next, please. Okay. So how does that translate into social differentiation? How does that translate into stratification? This is something that surprised me when I first, because we have the map of, in a sense, every place in the country. You can map where scheduled caste populations are like, and of course it corresponds to a lot of the, so the reds are again areas that are below the national average of 17%. The greens where there's more than 17%, let's say. So you can see, Punjab, for those of us who worked in Punjab, understand that there's a very strong, in spite of the way that Punjab is structured into Hindu and Sikh populations, there's a very large proportion of the Sikh community who are actually scheduled castes. So you can see that actually coming up, big bands in UP and Bihar, obviously in West Bengal and parts of coastal Orissa, and you can see Tamil Nadu coming out there. So, you straight away start getting a sense, both politically and otherwise, where the deep challenges are as far as scheduled castes are concerned. The thing that personally surprised me a lot was when you start plotting the scheduled tribe population. And if you go back to Heimendorf and a whole range of other people, they talked about this swath that actually cut across India all the way down here, almost down to the Nilgiris, where tribal populations were dominant in some senses. The patterns are still there. And what really surprised me, at least, was the strong imprint that you see. Those are, again, people we worked in Rajasthan and parts of Gujarat will know that it's true. But this is a very interesting pattern which is not so obvious till you start visualizing it. And again, the base is relatively small, it's 9%, but there is particular sets of concentration. And when you look at land-based conflict and we look at forest right-based conflict, you can see where it comes from. I mean, for example, Gadchiroli, other areas in Maharashtra, edges on this side, you'll see challenges as far as that's concerned. So the reason I gave you this sweep is when we're able to look at the challenge holistically, we get a much better handle on what's actually happening, what the demographic drivers are like, what are the socioeconomic drivers, and this is very, very important for us to try and get a sense of how urbanization plays itself out.